Hello, Popcorn, and welcome back to another fantastic episode. We have a lot of new listeners lately, so for those of you who are tuning in for the first time, welcome to Popcorn. This is a podcast centered around a global Pakistani community, voiced by the youth across America, Canada, UK, UAE, and of course Pakistan itself. Every episode, we bring different guests from all over the world to discuss topics that affect us, whether they're serious topics or amusing ones. Because we have a global audience, we speak primarily in English, but oftentimes हम काफी उर्दू और पंजाबी भी बोल लेते हैं बीच में. To stay up to date on all of our content, check out our website popcorn.com and follow us on Instagram @popcorn. So let's get started for today. Today's guest is Israa Nasir. She is 32 years old, lives in the US, but was born in Pakistan.
So I actually was born in Pakistan, but I grew up in Saudi Arabia. So my parents lived in Saudi Arabia, I want to say from like 79 onwards.
When did you move from Pakistan to Saudi Arabia? Like what age were you?
Like I must have been 3 months or 2 months.
Oh, okay. After Saudi Arabia, Isra's family moved to Canada, and she'll get to that later. She did not actually live in Pakistan, but she visited there a lot.
Yeah, and Riyadh was only 5 hours away from Karachi, where I'm from. We went a lot. Like we went in the summer holidays because it was too hot there. It was like 50 degrees Celsius plus. Then we went in the winter holidays because it was too cold. It was literally 16 degrees because it's a desert, so it doesn't have the same kind of feel. We went for Ramadan, we went for Eid, we went a lot.
So Israa says she was really exposed to Pakistani culture because of the frequent travel to Pakistan, but then also she says her community in Riyadh was quite diverse.
So the community in Riyadh was very mixed for like the South Asian diaspora. I mean, you had your breakouts, but it was primarily more around like religious fault lines. So, you'd see a lot of the Hindu Indian group and their kids all went to the Indian embassy school, whereas the Muslim kids were primarily, if you're Pakistani.
So there wasn't so much a separation of countries, like people of the same religion from Pakistan, Bangladesh, India, they basically got along.
Yeah, it was less divisive than it is back home, like in Pakistan or India. I guess because it was everyone's home away from home, right? And people were just trying to find a community. So like our next door neighbors were from Bangladesh in Saudi Arabia, and they're actually our neighbors in Toronto as well. So it was like lifelong friends.
Wow.
Yeah, so we were friends with them. We were friends with the Pakistani family.
How did you like living out there in Saudi Arabia?
So I was there till I was 13. So at that time, it wasn't like I didn't have to wear the abaya or anything because I was only 13 years old. So my childhood there was actually, it was very nice. It was very sheltered. As a child, you don't know what you don't know. I obviously wasn't aware of all of the different things. I just kind of grew up thinking that women didn't drive. I didn't see a lot of women drive in Pakistan at that time either. So I just like assumed that women didn't drive, and you just like accept things for the truth when you're younger. So yeah, it was a really fun childhood.
If you had stayed out there, do you think it would have continued to be a good life, or do you think you're better off where you are right now?
This is a very interesting question. So again, like you don't know what you don't know, but I think at this time, with social media, you understand what's happening in the rest of the world, right? And for example, for my parents, their point of comparison was they were leaving Pakistan and Saudi Arabia was a greener pasture. Like now you understand that the rest of the world is open to you as well. So you're looking towards greener pastures, even if you're there. And the greener pasture is really like Europe and North America or Australia. It's just like the way the system is right now. Like, I don't know if I would be happy if I had continued living there. I think it would have been a very limiting experience for me. But I personally know people who are from that time in my life, who stayed there, who got married there, who have children there. In fact, one of my friends was just visiting in New York from Saudi Arabia. We were childhood friends. We were in the same building, but she stayed there. And she was like, Israa, I don't know if I would ever want to leave there and come live here.
Really?
She has children, and she was like, it would be such a hard life for me. Like over there, I have like XYZ help. I have such an easy life. I come here, it would all change.
It's so interesting to think about though, right? Because your friends who stayed there and you left, you moved on and came to Canada and the US, your best way of knowing how you would be and how you might enjoy life in Saudi Arabia, had you stayed, would be to look at your friends, because you basically would be a completely different person in many ways, right? You developed a little differently. You developed a different perspective from as an outsider now
Exactly.
from Saudi Arabia.
Yeah.
But those people who grew up there and their friends are there, their support system, their communities. I
Mm-hmm.
always like to think about that, oftentimes we'll think of a place as, oh, that it's probably not so much fun down there, wherever, not just Saudi Arabia, but anywhere. But you see people, even in the most limited places, even in the most restrictive or poorest, whatever you want, and they're having a blast and they're having a lot more fun because they have, at the end of the day, like that popular saying, the home is where the heart is. Their hearts are basically there. They have a good foundation. They have a good community nearby, and they never felt the need to leave that.
Exactly.
I sometimes envy that because I moved around a lot in my life. So I've never actually settled down in a place and had like permanent friends or permanent communities that I settled in with. So sometimes I really envy those people who stayed back wherever.
Yeah, the rooted people.
At the age of 13, Israa and her family packed up and moved to Canada. And that's where she spent the majority of her life so far.
I essentially grew up there. So when I think of home, right, I think of Toronto, because I guess like my memories of Toronto are so much nearer, and I developed into the person that I am in Toronto, right? So I went to high school there, I went to university there, and then for my master's, I came to New York, and I did a 2-year master's here, and then I went back to Toronto, and then I'm currently in New York now. So I came back to New York.
So she moved from Toronto to New York, then back to Toronto, then back to New York. And she says New York is a place where she's probably going to settle for now.
So my husband he's not from New York. He's Canadian, but he was living here. And then when it came to making a decision, it was like a no shot for me. I was more than ready to come to New York. We didn't even discuss coming to Toronto. I mean, I just love New York, and I was devastated to go back after I finished my master's. You
mentioned that you consider Toronto home, but then at the same time you mentioned moving to New York was a no-brainer with your husband.
Yeah.
Meaning New York was flat out the choice. So what made you think of that? Like your home versus a different city, and of course not any city, but New York, obviously you'll find any opportunity there. But I'm sure Toronto's not lacking either. So what made you choose that?
I mean, the answer is in your question. It's not any city, it's New York City. And I could go on forever. We could do a whole episode. New York is just unique in that way. It's amazing, it's interesting, it's exciting.
So the first time that she moved to New York was for her studies in mental health. And then when she went back to Toronto, she started practicing in that field. And that is when her journey in mental health began.
I studied mental health, and it is, as we know, the most poorly funded industries here. And there's just no money to sponsor non-Americans. So I looked for work here, and I very sadly moved back to Toronto. And it was actually great. I mean, I did amazing work in mental health in Toronto with an organization that is really, really sensitive and aware of different cultures and different cultural needs. They were very involved in the South Asian mental health community, very open to providing like refugee services, mental health services for refugees. So I did great work there, and then I came back here.
I see.
And now I work in technology. So I work in health tech. I work at a mental health startup for tech-enabled services.
Got it. Okay, so you're still working in mental health, but kind of from a different angle.
Yeah. I'm definitely not providing any direct services here. And I just wanted a little break from that. I wanted to kind of see what else is out there. And also it's going towards there. I think everybody will at some point will have to start using technology for mental health.
So now she's working in health tech in New York City. And I asked her to quickly define what health tech is with an example.
So health tech is a broad sector which essentially works on integrating technology into healthcare delivery. So far you kind of see technology as like the background in healthcare. So it's the radiology machines, it's the MRI machines, right? But this is really looking at how can we integrate it into delivery. So how can we use technology to do assessments? How can we use technology to streamline the process where somebody receives services? So for example, if you go into offices now, like a PCP office, like a primary care physician, you sign in on an iPad and you put in all of your like allergy, and your medication and all of those things into this iPad, and then it directly populates the file for the doctor, and now it's there. And by the time you enter the doctor's office, they have everything ready to go and they're updating it real time.
So I'm going to skip forward around this part where Israa and I started talking about our careers at length, and I will fast forward all of that to right here, where we started discussing her experience with mental counseling in Toronto and relating it back to the Desi community.
The company I worked for, or the clinic, I guess I should say, it was super diverse. So I had patients who were white Canadians. I had clients who were Black Canadians, Pakistani, Indian, and even between that, there was like Muslim, Sikh, Hindu. I had like East Asian. So it was a pretty good mix. I just know that in that area, the leading South Asian mental health agency it was another agency that was like very specific to South Asians.
Mm-hmm.
And so what we did is we worked a lot with someone who's brown, but ultimately like would make like a referral to that, because not only was that a mental health agency, it was also like a community support agency. So they had family counseling, they had other programs. So a lot of the Desi people in that area who needed support would go there. But then you'd also get those people who don't want to do that because it was brown. So there's a risk of running into somebody or whatever, right?
Yeah, right.
Yeah, stay here, or the referral would come to us.
Were they putting in some effort to attract people in to, understanding that the Desi community, especially the Pakistani community, can have some resistance in terms of understanding or getting their mental illnesses treated or looked at, right?
Mm-hmm.
Were you aware of any of these companies or clinics actually putting an effort to attract people in or advertise themselves or kind of, have some kind of initiative to change people's perceptions, or were the patients just coming in by their own will?
So, I mean, a lot of the patients that I saw were coming in through the hospital, the emergency. So that was like a big funnel, is when someone is brought to emergency and they have a mental health issue, it's like a mental health crisis of some kind, or something has happened in the home and the neighbor called the police, right? And they brought them to the hospital. So that was one way we would get individuals. And that's honestly a very common way where we would get these South Asian families. But on the flip side, the agency, and even like at a citywide level, a lot of the ads are targeted in different regions. So if you go to a region that's like predominantly Desi, like the one I worked in, the company's ads and billboards and marketing would be done in different languages, and also would have different people of color in their ad campaign. You would see like this Desi auntie with put on her head, and it says it in Urdu at the bottom.
Oh, I see. Okay.
You struggling with sadness, or are your children like something to do with your children, or addiction, or domestic violence, right? And you would see it in Korean, and it would be like a Korean family.
But I'd be really curious how they worded that on that ad you mentioned in Urdu.
Yeah. So the interesting thing is, even when we were let's say my colleague got like a Urdu speaking patient, and I was like just informally translating in that moment. One of the things that I really noticed is that we only have really complicated language for mental health in Urdu. It's very diagnostic. It's very clinical. There's really no good colloquial way to say depression. There's just no language for it, right? Like something that I've learned over the years in working with collectivist cultures, East Asian cultures, South Asian cultures, even some Hispanic, is that you don't talk about it clinically. You don't talk about it from diagnostic criteria. You talk about it in the symptoms. So you ask about the symptoms as if you are asking about the problem. And people are more forthcoming. So like Desi aunties and uncles are more forthcoming in talking about the fact that they can't sleep properly, or they haven't been eating properly. And you can kind of talk through the symptoms, but there's no word for depression.
I see. Thinking back to this, Israa is right. There is no word for depression in Urdu. In fact, as I started thinking about it, there's a lot of words that don't exist in Urdu, and we just borrow them over from English or other languages. For example, computer became computer, bicycle became cycle, glass became gloss, IT became IT. So just like that, depression became Well, depression. The only thing that I could find after searching for depression in Urdu on Google was the translation Zehni Dabao. And that kind of makes sense, but I don't think it's used in the medical world. And that's not to pick on Urdu. To be honest, English also borrowed from a lot of languages. In fact, that's how languages evolved over time. They borrowed from each other. So that's completely fair. But at a certain point, Urdu and a lot of other languages just stopped building new words, especially as our society progressed medically and technologically, which is why, for example, we don't have words like computer in Urdu. But then for depression, this is especially problematic, as Israa will explain. Because we don't really have a direct translation for depression, that's part of the reason why our society, our Desi community, struggles to kind of understand it. That it's not just a state of mind, it's actually a real disease.
And even if you're talking about sadness, you hear people say, like, yeah, well, everybody gets sad. Everybody gets sad. Like if you say it in Urdu, right? So like you have to really like push against like, but are you sad all the time? Like, have you ever like been at a party and just felt sad? And then triangulating with the other symptoms. And that's the best way to talk about it.
Yeah, you got to give kudos to the people who can get that kind of help, meaning let other people help them, right?
Yeah.
Because that's the most important thing. When people, especially in our culture, I've noticed this, and I'm going to ask you the same question, but I've noticed that culturally speaking, people can be closed to getting others' help in our culture, meaning they'll admit, like I have an aunt, for example, she'll admit that she's sad all the time. It's hard to get out of bed. I don't feel like doing anything. I've lost interest in all my hobbies. But as soon as you mention depression, no, that's not it. That's just made up. It doesn't exist. I think there's a lot of change in the younger generation. People admit that this is a real problem. We were raised with this, right? With this understanding, with this. A lot of us took subjects in this in school. So we see this in our friends. Our friends go through this all the time. So we know it's very real and it can affect anybody. And sometimes for no reason at all. But then with the previous generation, they've been raised a lot more, I guess, strictly, a lot more hardened to just kind of face your life no matter what. And medicines are evil, that type of thought, which can sometimes cause a lot of problems. Do you see some of that?
Yeah. I mean, I think this is very prevalent in the older generation, like the generation of our parents. I mean, I've seen it both in my own family and I've seen it in like my work. I think it's like multiple things, and I've heard multiple things like over and over, and it's the same three buckets. So one is this medication stigma, right? This idea that if I say I have depression, like if I'm sad, nobody can give me medication for it. But if I say I have depression, now all of a sudden I need medication, and medication always leads to hospitalization. So this fear of being hospitalized, and that has to do partly with the way mental health hospitals were at that time, like just even as recently as the 80s, like the late 80s in Pakistan, and like the legalities around who can get somebody institutionalized. It's very easy there. A family can take their daughter and have her institutionalized against her will, and she doesn't need to meet any criteria, really. So there's a lot of that, this medication thing, and then there's a lot of shaming through religion, like using religion to shame somebody who has a mental health issue or a claim or accepts it, right? This idea that, well, you're ungrateful to God, or you are, if you just have enough faith, if your faith is not strong enough, that's why you're feeling anxious, that's why you're feeling depressed. And so people don't want to accept those things. And the third thing is we are just really secretive people. I read a great book about South Asian culture called Of Silk Saris and Miniskirts. It's actually written by a Canadian sociologist, and she essentially explores this idea that brown culture is a very secretive culture. We are taught from childhood to maintain our family secrets and to hide them. And this might be like a offshoot of living intergenerationally. I don't know why it is, but it is, right? So she might accept it to you as sadness. Like I'm just using your aunt as an example.
Yeah.
But the secret of her illness must remain a secret. And if she names it, it becomes real, and then other people will know.
Yeah, right.
And all these three things kind of get together, and it really prevents people from accessing help.
Right. Exactly. They're obstacles. At this point, I took a step back to catch Israa up on a story that I had told a few episodes ago on this podcast. And I'm going to repeat that short story right now. So the story is about my mom. And my mom was telling me basically after I told her a little bit more about cannabis and CBD-based products, she basically pointed out her belief that अगर आप 5 वक्त की नमाज पढ़ते हो, if you pray 5 times a day, you don't need any other medication or treatment for depression or anxiety or things like that. And that was her argument and her viewpoint. So this was just me kind of describing that story and setting the stage with it for a discussion. She was like, what is this cannabis? What is this CBD thing? And I mentioned, I was mostly joking around, but I said, this treats anxiety, depression. It's, helped a lot of people apparently. And she was like, I don't know why people believe in that. Like, all you have to do is pray 5 times a day and you'll, like, she said it in Urdu Punjabi, she was just like, देखो कितना सुकून मिलेगा अगर 5 वक्त की नमाज पढ़ोगे. And I was like, just again, looking at some people in my family and outside of my family. And I've seen some people who do pray 5 times a day. And they're actually very, very anxious. It's a difficult topic too, because people get very emotional when it comes to religion. And that's not what we're trying to trigger here. We're not saying that the prayer is not working. It's just more like maybe the prayer isn't meant for this. Maybe, the prayer is more meant for kind of preparing for your afterlife and, getting yourself washed of your sins.
Yeah, there's like a separation between like medicine and religion. And I mean, you know what? Individuals who have a sense of faith tend to do better in chronic illnesses and terminal illnesses. Like this is like studies have shown this. Like if you have 2 cancer groups and one is a faith-based group and one is not, the faith-based group exhibits lower signs of depression and has better prognosis.
Yeah, I believe that.
Like you can pray and for sukoon, but it's not going to solve your problem. It will help you manage it better, right? But what we want people to also focus on finding a solution, a treatment. And I know even like my dad used to say this, right? Like imaan kamzor hai, this is like before, like long ago when I wasn't studying this. And we can talk about that a little bit, but how I've seen the narrative change in my own family because just one person decided to pursue mental health as a career, right? So if more people do it from our like generation, we can start to see changes. But yeah, so he would say that, like iman mazboot karo and people will be okay. And I would always say to him is like, that's not going to solve it. That will, I'm not saying people should stop praying and only take meds. You know what I mean?
Of course not. Yeah. Right. Of course not. Yeah. Like you mentioned, actually, I don't doubt that at all. The stat that you mentioned earlier regarding how well religious people do in comparison to non-religious people in the face of adversity, right? I've actually read something like that before as well, and I absolutely believe it. One of the things that my mom says that I feel like is actually true is she says there's a lot more anxiety nowadays because people don't have faith. If you have faith, you don't have to fear death. Religious people often don't fear death, I feel like, as much as non-religious folks, because, we have this this whole concept in our religions of an afterlife, and we're doing the right thing, and we're confident we're doing the right things, and we're helping people, we're doing our fair share, then hopefully we will go to heaven. So just the thought of that from a worldly perspective, right? From kind of a secular point of view, just having that kind of belief system can give you a lot of peace of mind, I can imagine.
Yeah.
Even when you're sick.
Yeah. And it doesn't have to be like religious faith, but like any kind of faith. So even people who very strongly believe in science and they believe in, what happens to the body after, and this is like their belief system and it's completely unwavering. It just having faith in some, people just need something bigger than themselves to believe in.
Absolutely. Yeah.
Right. And it gives us hope. It gives us optimism. It helps us make sense of the seemingly senseless things that happen in the world every single day. And it's the same thing with mental health, right? Mental illness is so uncertain. And that's why it's really important to understand it well, to kind of attack it on all fronts, right? Like medication alone doesn't solve anything. Sometimes counseling or therapy alone doesn't solve anything. Sometimes, maybe you need to involve somebody from your family in there, right? Because if the environment at home is what's adding to this, then no matter how much work you and I do in my office, you're going to go back home every day, right?
And it's also, when it comes to mental health, people often talk about faith or something else that's lacking, right? Let's just go to a concert, you'll feel happier. Go to, or something like that. That's only when it comes to mental health. When it comes to physical health, then we're open to taking all sorts of drugs. Take Advil for pain relief.
Immediately.
take this for your high blood sugar. Take this for your hypertension. Take supplements for your lack of iron in your blood. So we take all sorts of things for our physical ailments. But when it comes to mental health, for some reason, people just get very turned off by it. They think that something's wrong with them, and that's not necessarily the case. I feel like to some extent, nobody is actually normal. Everybody has some problems.
Exactly. And also, I think it's because you can't see it, right? And we're going to talk about South Asians like Desis.
Yeah.
It hasn't been part of our like cultural consciousness for too long. It's a very new concept. People still will confuse mental illness and jinns, right?
Right.
I still hear stories that people are confusing the two. So it's a fairly new concept to many people. And I think our depiction of it is also very intense and exaggerated. So if you watch any dramas, like the most famous drama to come out of Pakistan in recent times, maybe like the only, was Humsafar. I mean, the Toronto Star had a half page dedicated to it, like the biggest local newspaper in Toronto. And in the last episode, and I'm not ruining this for anybody because it's been like 7 years. So if you haven't seen it now, it's not my fault.
I haven't finished it, but you're not going to spoil it for me. Yeah.
The mother-in-law becomes mentally ill, but the depiction they show of her is like this just wild woman, And mental illness doesn't look like that. Everyday mental illness looks like deep sadness and social anxiety and not feeling worthy of love. And, you obviously have the psychotic disorders that exist and they're there, but the depiction of mental health is always as if this person is like just completely out of their mind. So people are afraid. They don't want to be associated with it. They don't want to take medication that indicates they have it. They just want to hide it.
You interestingly mentioned earlier that a lot of the cases that come to the clinics are referrals from the ER, right? From the emergency room.
Yeah.
It often has to come to that threshold of actually maybe a panic attack that led to the ER, and now these people have to get treated, right? And I think panic attacks are a very common cause of ER visits. Actually, they're mistaken for heart attacks. They're mistaken for a lot of other things other than panic attacks until the doctors rule them out. And so it has to come to that level for people to realize, okay, this is getting a little out of control. And then they have to come see a mental health clinic.
And sometimes they'll come the one time and then they'll never come again.
Really?
Yeah.
When you say come the one time, are you talking about ERs or are you talking about clinics?
The clinic. So this incident has happened. And this is again like one program in this entire organization that I worked in, right? So there's other programs. There are people who walk in. But I would say that there are a lot of people who come through the ER.
I see. Why do you think they would only come, many of them would come once though?
I think it's the stigma that there's nothing wrong. This was just this one thing that happened, or, it's not going to happen again. It just happened this one time.
Right. What was part of the treatment for them? Was it a combination of medicine plus therapy, or was it just one or the other?
I think it just depends on the person. So you can have any permutation. You can have people who are just on medication. You can have people who are just doing counseling if they actually don't need medication. And that's another stigma, or I guess that's a myth around mental illness, is that you always need medication and medication only. I mean, there are so many things that you can manage without medication just through talking to somebody, right? Prolonged stress can become anxiety, and you don't always need anxiety medication to help you. Sometimes you do, and that's important. And sometimes you don't, and that's also important. Right?
That's true. But as difficult as I know it is for people in South Asian communities to take some pills, right, that treat, let's say, depression, like an SSRI or something, as difficult as that is, I feel like that's still easier than going to a counselor and talking about all your problems. As it's very uncomfortable, I think, for people in our culture, especially the older generation, to just open up to a stranger about their problems. It seems like another stigma.
Absolutely. I think it's definitely an obstacle. This idea, again, we are fear-based, we're secretive, and going to therapy and counseling is diametrically opposed to those two things. You have to be vulnerable, you have to be honest, and you have to talk about things that you want to hide about you or your family, right? It's all about
Yeah.
name and honor, even though the person
Mhm.
sitting across of you like is nobody, like you don't know them, they don't know your community. So
Yeah.
I think that it's changing. I think it's changing a lot. Like even people
Mhm.
who are in their 40s, I would say even 50s, who are in
Mhm.
North America are much more open to it. I would say it's really like the older generation that is really opposed to it. I mean, I've heard people like aunties, older aunties say things like, so what? Like, you're just like, what should I do? Should I just like take medication and you're just going to throw me in a hospital?
Mm.
Again, it's that direct linkage to an institution, right? That's one
Mm.
thing. The other thing is, what's the point of telling somebody who's outside our family they're not going to solve anything?
Mhm.
But I will say that the trends I just have seen, even around me, people even in their 50s are open to it. And I can't speak to what's happening in Pakistan. I know the people my age in Pakistan, the people that I know are very open to it. I think there's a huge accessibility issue. I think
Yeah.
you have to have a lot of money to access the service. So that's not available to everybody. But I do know that the people that I know are open to it. They talk about it. I think I mentioned this earlier to you, but even like it was like Mental Health Awareness Day, and a lot of the Pakistani celebrities were tweeting about it or putting Instagram ads about it or Instagram
Mhm.
posts. So even there, the culture is shifting.
It is shifting, yeah.
I think, unfortunately, and it's like our cross to bear.
Mhm.
The people who are in this generation who are first or second generation who grew up here, we have to really try to unlearn the things that we've been taught about mental illness in our families, and we have to kind of break the stigma.
Right. For us, it's great, right? I think for us, it's good. We have the opportunity to unlearn and learn new things.
Yeah,
That's one of the great things about living here. It's so dynamic. You can learn so much stuff. You can get rid of all sorts of biases that you were maybe raised with. So you can really open yourself up, right? But the unfortunate thing is that our parents or the generation before us, they don't, even when they're here, they oftentimes don't expose themselves to that kind of openness. So, for example, if I look at my parents, they, first of all, they don't go out of the house much.
mm,
And when they do, they're basically going to some other auntie's house.
mm,
There's not a lot of exposure to non-Pakistani,
mm.
American society. So they just don't. They're just not open to that. To the point that sometimes they don't even care about American politics. They don't want to watch. My mom thinks English movies are a waste of time.
Mm.
Uh,
Yeah,
things like that. That's unfortunate because at this age, at that age, I feel like the prevalence of mental health goes, the need for help for mental health can go up. Like I feel like age 50 and beyond, oftentimes there's kind of an existential crisis for a lot of the older generation. But the whole point was just it's sad. I wonder at some point in your life, I guess you feel very strongly about this. I know, but there's got to be some way to help the previous generation who is the situation's not going to get better for them at this point on. They need more help, they need more support in terms of, I guess, understanding themselves and being open to others, like allowing other people to help them.
yeah.
So moving on to the topic of seeking help, Isra already kind of highlighted the two major forms of treatment for depression, number one being medication and number two being therapy. And I asked her to kind of zoom in on number two, which is therapy, to kind of rationalize that and explain that against a desi argument. How does it help to, I guess, sit in a room and talk to a therapist about your problems? I can see that sometimes people need somebody to talk to, and that helps.
Mm.
But how does it help from a medical perspective? That's what I think desi people have a difficulty understanding too. Like, especially desi uncles and aunties, they'll be like, what exact benefit does it bring to just talk to a random stranger about all our problems and then opening up to them, and
Yeah.
exposing all of our secrets?
Well, the one thing is, you often hear people say, I just feel better. Like it just taking it off my chest, like getting it off my chest. There is something
Mm-hmm.
about not being alone in your misery, right? Even if
Mm-hmm.
the person sitting across of you is not going to solve the problem, it's just there's something validating to sit in an emotional space with somebody who is listening compassionately and just is there for you, right? That's why we feel
Yeah.
better after venting to our friends or families or
Mm-hmm.
partners, right? With this
Yeah.
added layer of clinical training, I mean, and this is what I say. to people in my family, like my extended circle. And this also kind of answers the question you asked earlier about like, how is there even a way to help our older generation at this point, right? And the answer
Hmm.
is you have to talk to them and
Hmm.
explain this, right? So with this added layer of clinical training, the clinician is trained to listen for behavior patterns. Sometimes it's us who are getting, like, we are getting in our own way, right? So if we take the example of like an auntie, like a desi auntie who is sad about the way things turned out for her kids, she's only looking at it from one perspective, right? And she's adding a lot of value to that perspective. But there are multiple other perspectives. And sometimes having
Hmm.
a clinician say it and then outline these behavior patterns that you exhibit that keep you in your sadness, just illuminating that like self awareness is something that's really beneficial.
Hmm. Right.
Problem in mental health over across the board
Overall.
is
Yeah.
when people feel like there's nothing they can change, they're not open to help.
Right.
You have to know that there's always a different perspective, that there's always a different way to do something, that there's always a different way to get there. There's like multiple roads that lead to Rome, right?
Hmm.
And it's the same for you as an individual.
Yeah. Right. Wait, we're not done yet. After we stopped the recording, Israa sent me a voice note with her final thoughts and recommendations for you, our listeners. Because it's very possible that this topic may be relevant for you or your family members, and hearing Israa out on her thoughts might be very beneficial for that. So here's Isra's note.
For the people who are listening, I wanted to say that if you feel like you might have some kind of mood issue, or you might feel a change in yourself or people around you, somebody you care about, like your friend or your parent, just know that it's really common. You know, the WHO, the World Health Organization, they say about 300 million people across the world from all age groups experience depression. And so it's really important to look out for some of the most common signs and symptoms. And that usually looks like feeling a constant sense of like a low grade sadness at all times. And the things that you used to enjoy are no longer giving you the same kind of joy or pleasure. So if before you used to really enjoy playing video games, you suddenly start to feel like you don't care about that anymore, or it doesn't give you the same kind of joy. And it's different than growing out of something. It really just feels like nothing you do is bringing you joy on the inside or happiness. It also looks like irritability, or like you're quick to lose your temper, or you have like suddenly really low patience. It comes with like having trouble concentrating, feeling tired all the time. You might notice a pattern, like your sleep pattern changing. So maybe you're sleeping too much, or you're not sleeping enough compared to your normal. It's same thing with food. You might find that you're eating too much compared to before, or suddenly you have no appetite whatsoever. And so if you start feeling or noticing these changes in yourself or somebody you're close to, it's important to talk to your doctor about it. I don't want to say anything that's a recommendation, because this is a medical health thing. But I will say that I encourage everybody, even people in my own family, the first step really is you have to talk to your doctor about it and have an honest conversation with your doctor about it. And if you feel like your personal family doctor maybe is too attached to your family, like everybody in your family goes there, your mom goes to the same doctor, or if you're here and your doctor is Pakistani or Indian and maybe you feel uncomfortable talking to another brown person about this, find another doctor, go to a walk-in doctor, but a good one, somebody you trust. You should be able to have very honest conversations with your doctor without feeling shame. So just talk to them about this change and see what they recommend. But don't let it just go. Don't think that it will go away on its own. Sometimes it does, but it's always really important to be proactive in your own health. And, you deserve to feel good and feel happy in the life that you have. So always just talk to your doctor about it. That would be my biggest recommendation. But Habib, thank you so much for this opportunity. And I hope this helps somebody out there. That's the best that you can hope for. It's been an absolute pleasure talking with you. Thank you so much for having this conversation, giving this topic a platform. I was really excited to have this conversation with you because I know that it will reach a larger Pakistani audience in Pakistan, over here, and just get the conversation going about this. And, the more we talk about some stuff like this, the more people become aware, and it just increases awareness, which is really the first step in breaking the stigma around mental health and mental illness. So I'm really glad that we had this conversation.
If you enjoyed this episode of Popcorn, remember to check out our other episodes. You can easily find all of them on our website, popcorn.com. You can also find us on Spotify, Google Play, iTunes, जहाँ भी आप podcast को सुनते हैं, and पटारी पे भी हम हैं. So find us wherever you want to listen to us and subscribe. We also really appreciate positive reviews on iTunes. And if you have any feedback, any questions, any comments, we love feedback. Feel free to message us on Instagram. You can follow us at popcorn on Instagram, or email us at hello@popcorn.com. We love getting feedback. We love hearing from you. And this podcast is specifically made for you, our Pakistani audience. I do this as kind of a side hobby right now. I do it out of pure passion to bring the Pakistani youth together across the world. And I hope I'm somewhat successful at doing that through this podcast. Thank you so much for listening. We'll see you next time.